I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Meredith Friedson. Dr. Friedson is a licensed psychologist in the state of New York and soon to be licensed in New Jersey. She's the author of the book Subjective Darkness: Depression as a Loss of Connection, Narrative, Meaning, and the Capacity for Self-Representation. Her recent articles include Subjective Darkness: Depression as a Disintegration of Meaning in the Core Narrative, and Psychotherapy and the Fundamentalist Client: The Aims and Challenges of Treating Jehovah's Witnesses. Her areas of research include depression, trauma of all forms, the clinical treatment of schizophrenia and other forms of psychosis, loss, subjectivity, alienation, and social justice issues, including the effects of police stops on Black and Latino individuals. She's drawn to work clinically with some of the most vulnerable populations and believes that her position as psychologist is a privilege that carries with it the responsibility to treat each individual she works with humanely, with respect, dignity, and compassion. Listening to the space between what can be said and fostering a safe place in which creativity and play can develop are vital to her approach. Most importantly, she believes that a tremendous amount of psychological suffering comes from feeling unrecognized, misunderstood, denied, rejected, or unseen. She therefore strives to be present with each individual and engage with them on their terms, without imposing her own views, judgments, or agenda. Dr. Friedson is active in the academic community and has a private practice in Manhattan. She hopes one day to teach and to create a new treatment setting for working with schizophrenic adults who have been institutionalized for many years, one that values their autonomy, agency, creativity, and basic human dignity. Maybe you could start by telling me just a little bit about your path to becoming an analyst.
Well, technically, I'm not an analyst yet. I haven't had formal analytic training, although I plan to pursue that. I work analytically, I think, and psychodynamically, because I went to Adelphi, and they're very much psychodynamic and psychoanalytically oriented.
Very much so.
I think I appreciate more of an analytic approach because it's in some ways messier and you can be more playful. So I think I ordinarily would be inclined originally to have more certainty and like it's more comfortable having clear cut goals and all that stuff. But I think the gray area is important, and getting comfortable with uncertainty and being able to live in that space and kind of allow the freedom to see what develops and play is part of why I enjoy working that way. So it's been kind of like taking a little bit to get to a place where that's my comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. And you just had a book come out last year called Subjective Darkness. And I just want to say that one of the things I really loved about it was like how eclectic you were and all the different analysts that you referenced throughout the book. It's like there's Lacan and Winnicott and all sorts of different like relational, Freud, like it kind of runs the gamut. And so many analysts I feel are very like stuck in one kind of way of seeing. And you really wove together all these different perspectives. And I really appreciated that.
I appreciate that you appreciate that because I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. But I guess I feel like all of these different people have so much to offer, and I just kind of devoured whatever I could get my hands on, and one thing led to another, and yeah.
What was the process that was coming out to make the book?
Life's work. I think when I got to grad school, this was from my dissertation in grad school. And when I first started doing this work, I was lucky enough to be with a research advisor who wanted it to be personally meaningful. And so I had struggled with depression, actually, lifelong, starting in childhood. And I thought, if I can make something meaningful of this, then that will be healing, ideally. And so I think I'm trying to process all of the literature and all of the reading and the writing I did. It was kind of like talking about how language fails in conveying really important things internally, and then trying to find words to write about that was like recreating the very process of depression that I was reading about and writing about.
Right.
But when I was able to do it and come up with something, I would be writing something. Hang on, sorry. I would be writing something that was really painful or depressive, and I would get excited because it's like, yes, I finally have words for this.
And I also love how you use the patience words. Like the book, for those who are going to read it after hearing about it, is laid out in the way that the first few chapters are theory and like where Meredith is coming from in the beginning of writing the book and thinking about depression. And then the last few chapters are about different case studies. But the great thing that you do is use the patient's own words in each of those chapters. And that's something really different as well.
I wanted to try and keep their language intact and to be, I guess, loyal to their experiences. And that was one of the things that I struggled with when I was approaching this work, because as soon as it leaves them and then it becomes a collaborative thing, and then I do something with their words or to their words, I was so afraid of doing damage in some way or like misconstruing their meaning, because I feel like depression is at its core feeling in some ways misunderstood or disconnected. And so I very much didn't want to do harm in, like, they gave me a gift by sharing with me their experiences. So it was important to me to kind of blend, some theoretical background with people and their voices.
What kinds of clinics do you work in, or private practice, or?
Well, I just started a private practice in the city, Manhattan. And that's kind of just starting out, but I'm also currently working at a state psychiatric facility with people, with adults with schizophrenia who have been institutionalized for decades, some of them 30, 40 years. I don't know that I will remain in that environment because it's oppressive in a lot of ways, but I do love the work. So in terms of clinical work, I'm drawn to psychosis and schizophrenia and trauma, depression, intergenerational transmission of trauma, all kinds of really intense stuff.
No, me too. And I worked in the hospital system for a long time before I went into private practice full time. I guess it was about 10 years. And then like the last few years of being in the hospital was doing that while I was opening my practice. And then I finally switched over. But I really enjoyed the work with the patients in the hospital setting. It was so rewarding for them and for me. And I felt like I was going to really miss that. But it was just like working within the institution just became too difficult after a while, and you kind of understand why so many clinicians in those kinds of settings are really burnt out or kind of disconnected, or at least when I first started working in the institutions, I'd be frustrated that they didn't seem to really be listening or care. But you realize, like, after so many years, they have to kind of block things out or something just to be able to cope with that environment, It's
really soul-crushing. I mean, it's quite devastating. I came in, I feel very bright-eyed, bushy-tailed with all of these ideals and standards, and I've fought against them being chipped away by the institution and the way that the administration runs things. And as a result, I don't think I can survive there, because I don't want to compromise who I am as a clinician, as a human being. But it makes me sad, because there are not enough people who can survive in that environment with integrity and care for some of the most vulnerable people. So when I do leave them, I'm going to miss it a lot, the patients.
Yeah. I still do. I moved to New York in 2008, so it was right when the economy had collapsed. And I was working for Health and Hospitals Corporation, and their solution was to not fire anyone or have layoffs, but if anybody left their position, they wouldn't fill it. So
Right.
like when I started there, after, I think there was 8 of us or something. And then by the time I left 5 years later, there was 2 of us and a part-time social worker kind of thing. And I was only part-time. And it was we had the same amount of patients that 8 people were seeing originally,
Yeah. One of the things that I feel like I'm maybe not allowed to speak about it publicly, but one of the things that I wish that people knew about these institutions is that people go there, they get stuck, they get broken down, their agency is taken away, and they die there. I mean, some people are assaulted and die, and I've witnessed that. So as someone working in that environment, it's also, you can feel on a visceral bodily level, or at least I do, how deadening and kind of murderous a place it is. It's toxic and awful, and these are just beautiful people struggling.
No, absolutely. And I think I had a hard time talking about it more publicly as well, but I think it's important because I don't think that the majority of the population really understands how pervasive our systemic problems are as a country, and specifically in mental health, but how that's attached to the welfare system and the prison system and the education system and the pharmaceutical system. And I think working in mental health care, especially within the hospital setting, you really kind of see the intersection between kind of all of these systems and how pervasive it is, and how so many people are born into it and grow up on welfare and then get poor education and then end up incarcerated and then end up in the mental health care system. And it's just churning people through this kind of process over and over and over again, and has been for decades and decades. And I don't think most people realize that, And
they stuck, right. And then there's a separation between the reality of what actually happens and the perception of people who are mentally ill as this thing, this entity.
They're other.
Yeah, they're other, right? Which is part of, I think, why I'm drawn so much to working with them, because I can identify very much with this idea of being marginalized or outcast or just treated as less than, and I tend to want to fight against that.
Yeah, I think it's really important. One of the things I want to do is to get people to stop doing this kind of othering of people with mental health issues, because really, and the reason why I like the psychoanalytic perspective, it's all just different variations and different levels of the same kind of underlying structures that we all have. So sometimes maybe people get pushed to an extreme that's not manageable for them anymore, but it's not there's something fundamentally different about this person versus another person,
And the things that they're saying and doing on some level make sense. And I think one of the problems is the breakdown in communication when people start, doing this othering, where they think, especially with psychosis, where they think, oh, they're delusional, or oh, that's psychotic, or they don't make any sense. And it's well, if you try to understand where they're coming from, they make a whole lot of sense, even if it's not based in this shared reality. That's the nature of it. So I think the only way to be able to connect with people experiencing psychosis is to do it on their terms, to try and step outside of your own way of perceiving the world, of being in the world, and allow in what they're going through, and kind of tap into your own capacity for psychotic thought and experience, because only in doing that will you realize, oh, this actually makes a whole lot of sense given the context of their lives, and this is in some way protective of them to the alternative.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that you wrote about that in your book, as well as like a lot of times that somebody has a way of coping that they developed when they were young that was very functional and very adaptive given the environment they were in or the family system they were in. But then when you're outside of that environment or you get older, maybe something that you relied on or was your go-to kind of defense isn't working anymore, has become maladaptive.
Yeah, and I also think, I wish that people could understand the immense level of pain that underlies this. It's not that people are acting bizarrely or just, not in reality because they want to be troubling to the people around them. I mean, these are people who have experienced things that are so immensely, profoundly, life-alteringly painful a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And there's no way, I mean, that's what trauma is. It's something that's overwhelming to the point that you cannot possibly process it. And so it takes its toll on the body and the psyche in different ways. And some people feel it physically. I mean, I feel it physically when I go into these institutions but yeah, the psychosis or depression or whatever form the struggle is taking is trying to ward off or protect against complete disintegration. And I think that's what's missing in the public discussions about mental health issues.
I don't know if you've read Darian Leader. He's a British psychoanalyst who's also a psychiatrist. But he wrote a book called What is Madness? I think it came out in maybe 2011. And I think you would really like him because it's great that he's talking from the perspective he has because he is an MD and is a psychiatrist. So even though I would love for that to not have more clout, it does in the world we live in right now. And it's really great that he writes articles like in The Guardian and that sort of thing. But this book, What is Madness, he talks about how in psychosis specifically, like these delusional structures, as people want to call them, have formed over time for a reason, and that it's not a good idea to tell people that they're delusional or that this is wrong or try to break that down because they've put this in place for a reason to help them function. And that if somebody's functioning with that in place, then who are we to change that? Like, what's the deal? And that one of the things that really spawned my, whatever I'm on, my mission that I'm on. I had this conference with Manja Steinkohler, this other analyst that's in Umbahagen. I guess it was 2015 on violence. And we had that because basically I was just leaving the hospital setting, I guess in 2012. And I had a really difficult case where I was struggling between my own idea of what was ethical and how I should be treating my patient versus what the hospital was saying I should do and what my supervisor was saying I should do. And basically, just like to make a long story short, it was a patient who was deemed psychotic, and I worked in an HIV clinic, so he had HIV. And basically, they kept hospitalizing him forcibly and wanting him to take medication because they said if he didn't take his HIV medication, he was like trying to kill himself. Like that was their rationale. But he had HIV since like the 80s, and he was a slow progressor, and so he didn't actually really need it. Like he wasn't deteriorating in that way, but they kept hospitalizing him anyway. And then he actually worked for the hospital system as an accountant. And so he was very smart and like together enough to be able to be an accountant for a large hospital. And he had this delusion, quote unquote, that he was from outer space or something like that and whatever. But he came to the earth, he was on this mission to to bring tidal energy to the world to kind of help the world be saved. And so we get off of oil and coal. He wanted to like go to natural energy sources. So it was like a really nice idea. But anyway, he like talked about this at work. And they basically called the, like, other people I don't know this, but the hospital system has their own police force. And we had, like, a police station underneath our hospital. And they basically, like, called the police on him because he said this stuff. And he ended up, like, getting put away. And then when he came out, he didn't have a job. And then he ended up, like...
stuff.
Yeah, and then he ended up homeless. And then he ended up in this, like, welfare system. And he was so depressed, understandably. And I was like, you know, I understand that, like, probably he's not an alien. But I'm like, people believe in Jesus. People believe in all sorts of things. Like, why can't he believe that? Like, what does it hurt anybody or matter, you know?
Right. I mean, I've sat in morning rounds and had psychiatrists say, oh, well, you know, this person is clearly delusional. They think they're a famous football player, and that means they're not ready to be discharged. And I'm thinking, well, so what if they believe that they're a famous football player? That's a cool thing to believe. I mean, if it's not interfering with their functioning, and like, why do you feel the need to try and take that from them?
Yeah.
And in terms of the you were talking about how
he had to force to take his medication.
Telling people that they're delusional is not useful. Mm-hmm. It only serves to further alienate them, and it's dehumanizing. It's a complete refusal of their entire identity, subjectivity, their reality. And I mean, I wrote about that in the book too. In terms of depression, it's this feeling of alienation and disconnection where you can't commune with another human being. And I think when it comes to psychosis, that's the very nature of it. It's like a flight from the agreed upon meanings, but it doesn't mean that it's meaningless. And
and some of our greatest leap forward come from people who don't agree with the agreed upon meanings. You know what I mean? Then that becomes the norm.
Also, a lot of the societally agreed upon meanings are insane. I'm actually attending the Second International Eric Fromm Psychoanalytic Conference this coming June in Berlin, and it's on putting society on the couch. And so one of the things that I'm writing about there is how people with psychosis actually are commenting on aspects of society that are insane, and they're speaking more coherently. And we designate large groups of people as, you know, not in touch with reality, and then we try and deaden that's what it is, necrophilia. Eric Fromm's idea of necrophilia, and how like institutions and many aspects of society take on this necrophilist position where we try and like take all of the nuance and all of the art and all of the beauty and brilliance of human experience and reduce it to these objective, concrete measures that don't actually mean anything. Mm-hmm. So we turn into robots or mechanized versions of ourselves. And in terms of being in this hospital system, I often feel like someone is in the process of dying or going to die or be murdered. And I'm not just talking about psychic annihilation. I mean, that's there too, but it often feels like on any given day, I might not come home in the same condition as I left. And for people who live there for decades on end, it's just, I don't think people in like society who haven't been in places like this can fathom what that reality is like. And it's quite terrible. So one of my missions long term is to come up with a new treatment model, a new setting that's humane and respectful and holds the dignity of our fellow human beings as the main concern.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that's now on the table again nationally with all of these violence that's been happening, is like having more mental health institutions open up more inpatient units again. And what about this idea that we're supposed to like catch criminals and like hold them ahead of time?
Oh, it's ridiculous.
It's
and
insanity.
also that's insidious. The making that leap is further reinforcing this idea that people with mental health issues are criminals and are violent and dangerous. I mean, some become that way in institutional settings, but that's not the vast majority of people. It's people who are struggling, who are scared. They're frightened of harm coming to them and likely have experienced that in the past. And then society treats them in such a way that reinforces this very real fear. So yeah, we've got to do better. We have to do something that's better than this. I mean,
and I noticed on your book as well, did you do the painting on the front?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about the painting. So actually, that painting was done by my grandmother, Ruth Friedson. She is currently 92, and she's just. I actually have that painting framed in my office, and when I was on internship in a community mental health setting, I had it hanging on the wall, and it's an image of what I think is a man kind of falling through the sky, and it's sort of ominous or depressive, and so I always thought it interesting when patients would happen to notice that painting in the course of our relationship or sessions. I mean, they would, and when within the context of the conversation it would come up. But yeah, my grandmother is a really immensely talented artist, and I have a collection of all of her paintings, and I actually have used her artwork on business cards. It's kind of like a way of honoring her and keeping her close, and she's just a sweetheart. So yeah,
that's fantastic. And I definitely am a big believer in the arts, and the arts is a form of therapy in itself, and processing. And I recently, I'm in Stockholm now, and I recently went to Copenhagen with my husband for a film screening that we were doing. And there was this exhibition of this person named Ovar Tachi, who I had never heard of before, but she was an inpatient in a mental health institution from like the 1920s, and I think she was in there for like 40 years or something like that. And they had this huge exhibition of all of these pieces that she had made, and she made like a lot of these paper mache kind of figures that were like actual like 3D sculptures, as well as drawings and paintings. And she's trans, and what surprised me is that even in the context of this show, like this also surprised me, like when we read like Schreber's memoirs. To me, it seems like if Schreber was alive now, he would have much more language for like what he was experiencing, and his possibility of being trans and the possibility for manifesting that than he did at the time. And it seemed like Overtachi was having something similar. And she considered herself a woman and, lived as a woman. But even in the exhibition of her work, they kept referring to her as he and he and he. And I just found that like so terrible and disrespectful.
Yeah.
But I do want to visit. They have a hospital. The hospital that she was in is now closed, of course. But it was like outside of Copenhagen a couple of hours, and I do want to visit because apparently they've taken a wing of the hospital and turned it into a museum of her work, and then they have like other gallery exhibits as well. So that's something I'm getting more interested in. Another psychoanalyst here in Sweden, this woman named Elizabeth Punzi, who's in Gothenburg, she's just recently invited me to go to this exhibition, this conference that she's putting together. There's a psychiatric hospital. There was two of them near one another, and they used to have a tunnel that went between them, and they would roll the patients like through the tunnel to like bring them to different treatments, ECT and these kinds of things. And the hospitals have since closed, but they allowed like the last residents that lived there before they closed, like in the 70s, to paint this tunnel full of images. And now the hospitals and the tunnels are going to be torn down. So she wants us, my husband has a publishing company, and she wants us to go and document it. He's also a photographer. And so we're going to go and document all of this art and make a book out of it before it's torn down. But that, between those two experiences, that's something I'm getting really interested in, is like, preserving past art that's been created in these hospitals, and then just looking more towards working with art with psychosis.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. And there are actually, where I'm working, many buildings that have been closed down for a long time, and there are remnants of life there. And, like you're talking about, paintings on the walls and different, you can see the way that people were living, and a lot of the buildings where I am have asbestos in them, so it's not like people can go in and kind of observe it, but they're all being torn down. So if you have an opportunity to go and, preserve something like that.
Because that's this idea of like outsider art versus like, I don't know, art school art or whatever, to me is so ridiculous. Like, art is art. And I feel like, if anything, it's outsider art to me that's like really art. Like, somebody needs to do this, they're compelled to do this, they're processing something through it, rather than like having an idea and a concept and then like executing it. Because to me, that's like all ego and like what your ego wants to create. And, like, isn't the point to like bypass the ego and see what your unconscious has to say?
You're reminding me a little bit of another thing that I was working on is having to do with schizophrenia. I was thinking that my patients can't not be themselves, and that's what makes them so beautiful, and that's what makes me love them so much. They're not all the pretenses, all the stuff that we build up around us to like exist in society and feel okay. They don't have a lot of that. They speak so honestly from their core of who they are, and they can't not do that. And when someone tells them, oh, that's psychotic, oh, that's delusional, they hold fast. They're like, no, this is my truth. Mm-hmm. And there's so much beauty in that. And I think that there's so much more potential than we allow these members of our society. And I feel like we could it would be so much better if we honored these qualities in people. I mean, they have so much to offer. And I'm thinking actually of one of my patients who also is, he's not from outer space, but he is here to prevent the next nuclear war. And he's, a consultant.
We need him.
Yeah, to like President Fast. And he's just, and we do kind of like interpretive dance in our work. We'll just be talking with each other and moving our feet in different patterns as we do so. And he's wonderful too. So I appreciate what you're saying about, art and expression.
And tell me more about that, how you got into more like interpretive dance or that sort of work.
Well, that's what I'm calling it with this one particular patient. I try to remain open, and I think play is such an important developmental capacity. And for people who, whatever form expression comes in, I want to try and receive it, because denying it or closing yourself off to it is just another kind of assault against the person. So this is a person who can read people's footsteps and hear different demands or communications in body language and in footsteps. And he often will kind of move one foot forward in a rocking motion a little bit as we were speaking. And so I just kind of instinctively started mirroring that in our communications one day. And it's turned into kind of a beautiful relationship, in that sometimes we'll share like this secret language, and I don't necessarily always know exactly what's being communicated telepathically to me, but it's kind of like I've been accepted into an inner world where more communication is possible. And I mean, sometimes we even end up doing the cha-cha as we're talking in the middle of the hallway. So yeah, there's so much beauty if people could be receptive to difference in others.
Yeah, and that's really meeting the patient where they're at and working in a way that works for them, being open to that. Because one of my problems with psychoanalysis, when people are too rigid about it and they have like one theory that they stick to, like I said, and kind of looking at every patient through that lens, when I try to read a bunch of different theories, and even like, I worked in hospitals for a long time, so I know CBT and I do relaxation training and all of these kinds of things, and even behavioral therapy. I know how to do all of that. And like if someone's having panic attacks, and it might be helpful to do relaxation training with them just so they have some coping skills so that they can do the talk therapy, I don't see the problem with that.
Well, it's the rigid clinging to one way of being, this dogma that is hindering. I mean, what do we lose by embracing different forms of communicating? It's like having access to multiple different languages. Some concepts can't be expressed in one language. Mm-hmm. The culture just doesn't have descriptions for it. So if we can tap into ones that do, I mean, I'm actually, I don't know why I'm associating to this, but I believe there's a phrase in Japanese, or it's like a word that specifically describes the sensation of looking through tears in your eyes or something, which I think is a cool concept. And it's,
No, I love that idea of thinking about it as different languages. That happens a lot. I speak English primarily, but I'm from Miami, so I know Spanish, and then I'm learning a bit of Portuguese, and now I'm in Sweden. In Sweden, they have this concept called lagom, which is like I try to understand it as like things are just right, but it's like the idea is that if things are just right, like evenly balanced, then that's perfect. So that's just like, it's like summed up in this word that everybody here kind of lives by, this kind of idea, but it's just different, and it's hard for me to articulate it in English,
Right. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I like that. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched upon that you think is important to mention?
What is important? I'm sure there are. I'm sure afterwards I will think of them.
Also, just for those who don't know, I met Meredith through this group Unbehagen that I started with, a group of kind of disgruntled psychoanalytic candidates that weren't really super happy with our training and wanted to find this kind of alternative way of educating ourselves outside of the formal institution. And it's really grown and turned into its own kind of community, and I've met such great people there, and like much more free thinkers, people that are more eclectic, open to trying new things and working in different ways, and I think all of that's really important.
I recently met a bunch of the people you're describing. I had been informed about Das Unbehagen through a friend, and kind of observed quietly from the shadows of the different discussions that were taking place. Yeah, it is a wonderful community. I'm really excited.
Would you be open to talking about that a little bit? I read about it online, and it seems so interesting.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I would love to talk about that.
What was the premise?
So it was a group relations conference through the A.K. Rice Institute and using the Tavistock Clinic model, and it was about leadership, identity, authority, in groups and systems, and the roles that we unconsciously take on in groups. And the premise was to study unconscious roles we take on in real time as they were unfolding. So it was very unstructured. Well, there were certain structures in place, but it, for the most part, was very unstructured. It reminded me very much of my interview to try and get into Adelphi University, just everybody in a room with no one saying, this is what we're doing. The purpose was just to learn about group relations. And it was, for me, it was very intense. For me, it was immensely painful and disorganizing. I felt psychotic the majority of the 3 days that we were doing this, but in a tolerable way. There was aggression and fears of annihilation and who's going to control the other person and who has a right to speak. I mean, in a group setting of maybe 50 people, as soon as as soon as the space becomes open for each and every person to do with what they wish, then you become hyper aware of, okay, if I say or do something, how will that affect other people? And if I refrain from engaging in a way that I feel is important to me, what am I giving up? So how do we exist in this communal space? And it was interesting to me because I realized, okay, I'm not entirely sure what role I take on, but I was aware that when there was aggression underneath the surface, or that I sensed, and then a denial of it, I was not okay with that. I was like, nope, this is going to come out in the open and we'll deal with it. But then when I would see conflict with other people, I wanted to try and repair or protect different party members. So,
what do you think about that difference?
What, that they're kind of, not contradictory, but they're kind of like different sides of the same coin. Well, I think for me, aggression and hostility and anger are much more sinister and dangerous when they're disavowed, when they're disowned and denied. It can be much more toxic. So I think if there's a conflict and there's something to be angry about or aggression, I would rather have it explicitly stated outright, and then I can deal with it accordingly, rather than the insidious ways that it manifests outside of our own awareness. But I'm also not like a sadist. So when I see people having a conflict, and not even one that's disrespectful, just conflict, I never realized how strong an impulse I have to kind of repair or protect or translate one person's communications for the other, because I often think I observe everything that's going on around me and try and take in and digest the chaos, which maybe is why I felt psychotic the entire weekend. But it's easy for me to see, okay, this is a conflict that's starting because this person feels unrecognized or misunderstood, and this person feels slighted, and they're not communicating. They're talking at each other, but they're missing. And if I can see that, I'll want to, help clarify. But sometimes people need to have the space and the freedom to kind of work their shit out and know that they're not going to destroy each other if they speak aggressively, or not aggressively, but if they express their hostility. And from this weekend, at least, I learned, I can survive a lot and I won't destroy people. And if you take care in the way that you relate to other people, it's really empowering. I mean, it's unlike any other experience I've had, and I would recommend it, but you need to have the constitution and you have to be in a good space, because it's really exhausting and draining and painful, but empowering and good.
Yeah, but I'm really glad we were talking about this towards the end, because it kind of, to me, summarizes or touches upon lots of different kinds of things that we've been talking about. And as society as a whole, like if mental health was less stigmatized, and people were more encouraged to talk about their feelings more openly, including the negative feelings, and they didn't feel so much like they were going to be othered or shunned or called, mentally ill or that sort of thing. And there was more of a place for discussion and emotion coming out in all sorts of different ways and communicating in all sorts of different ways. And I think our society would be a lot healthier, and we wouldn't have so much of these like violent outbursts that we're seeing and that sort of thing.
People could feel free to take off the mask. I'm wondering if you have seen the movie I Heart Huckabees.
No.
It's it might be my favorite movie ever. It's this existential film about, they're existential detectives that this person goes to investigate a coincidence. And it's very cerebral, and people often will watch it and say, I don't know what I watched, and I don't know if I liked it or not, but every time I see it, I come across something new. And the thing that's sticking out to me, again, this is like what I said about my patients, they can't not be who they are. Mm-hmm. There's a moment in I Heart Huckabees where one of the characters says, well, how am I not myself? And then it gets repeated over and over again to try and drive this point home. So to your point, if we could just drop all like the facade of having to be something other than who we are, there would be so much, I think, relief in that. But it's a terrifying prospect.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard Dr. Meredith Friedson. For more about Dr. Friedson, please check out her book, Subjective Darkness: Depression as a Loss of Connection, Narrative, Meaning, and the Capacity for Self-Representation, published in 2017 by Rowman and Littlefield. Her professional website is meredithfriedsonphd.com, where she recently started a blog. For more about me, visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or renderingunconscious.org. Recorded on the new moon, June 3rd, 2016. My lunar module could never rust. Take me to the moon, the dark side of the moon. Yeah, temporarily in is Lilith. And I bring to you, despised, and I seek your moment of freedom. Were, spare, developed, and idio cut. Creative space, habit, right there. As soon as the knowledge, by leaving the child. Fly to UK to sign books. Return home from UK. Brian Geisen and William S. His works, however, the definition, connective tissue, as the skin, limbs, and divination proved, was not that. Very be with you, know or not know, of laboring feel. Of laboring feet, know or not know. Be with you, very, that was not proved. And divination, as the skin, limbs, connective tissue, definition, his works, however, the Brian Geisen and William S. Return home from UK, fly to UK to sign books, knowledge by leaving the child, habit right there, as soon as this spare created an idiosyncratic space. Were, moment of freedom, despised, and I seek your, is Lilith, and I bring to you, temporarily in the dark side of the moon. Yeah, take me to the moon. My lunar module could never rest.